Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here. Today, we're lucky enough to get to speak with Will Tinkham, the author of The Teddy and Bara Show, a fantastic Bonnie and Clyde-esque story of two essentially outsiders, castaways, runaways, however you want to phrase it, as they not only learn and grow together, but do so and survive in some of the most difficult times in American history, or at least semi-modern American history. And it was just such an incredible story to get lost in. And I found that even though it was from an era that, and yeah, it was from an era that you don't get to read too much of, it was so easy to follow along in. And I think that that's a really underrated part of these types of stories. And just it was gripping from the beginning through till the end with the idea of the mind claps and everything. I loved it, and I love the characters and the innocence that they had in them. So really hats off to you, Will.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really loved it. I talked about this with our previous author just yesterday, Jeff Massinio. I think these two books this month had this incredibly strong sense of place to them that put me right there. And I think, Will, I don't know how you do your research, but being in the whenever the book is set, like the kind of 1920s, it felt like it was a tour of the whole decade, all the things that went down that decade. You've got Al Capone, the Great Depression, you're in the aftermath of war. There's people up to no good in Germany. There's loads of weird things going on through the book, but I'd like to ask you a little bit about how you did your research, how you got all that information together, what went into it.
You know, it happens with all my books. I just start with an event, usually, or sometimes a character. But like I was going for the child labor laws of the 1900s and 1910s. I mean, when little kids were working everywhere. And
Yeah.
I just Google mines are seem to me the scariest place for a little kid to be working anyway. And I Googled mine collapses. And the first one that came up was this one in northern Minnesota. Wow. I mean, it basically wiped out the whole little town that these people lived in. And the youngest person was 14. And I just kind of went from there. And I'm pretty sure it was on Facebook. Sometime before that, I had seen an article popped up on Fats Waller getting kidnapped by Al Capone to play at his birthday party. And they were giving him $100 a song and all the champagne he could drink. And I just always had that in the back of my mind. And so I had Chicago on kind of on the brain. And when I had him bolt out of Minneapolis, I steered him kind of toward Chicago with no idea how to get there. And I think I found photos of some guy who documented child labor laws back in the day, and there were had these little girls picking fruit and vegetables out in the fields. I mean, like 6 years old, working all day long in the fields picking, so one thing just leads to another, and somehow it always kind of works out.
I was gonna say
That's a really cool way to do. Oh, sorry, on you go, Ryan.
Oh no, my bad. I was just gonna say, based on all of that, did you find how much did you plan ahead when you were writing, or did it all just free flow, kind of like how Teddy and Bara were going through it?
It was a lot like the way they went through it. I got them down to Chicago. I mean, they weren't, I had no plans. They were in the whorehouse already. And I was wondering what I was going to do with these two people that I paired up. And somebody on Twitter asked the question, are you afraid of clowns? And I had sat back and I thought, clowns. And all of a sudden I had what they were going to do with their lives. And I backed up a little, made her a gymnast and a ballet, you know, prodigy. And he was already nimble enough from escaping the mine. And I said, oh, okay, I got that. And I made them clowns and they blew town. And it was pretty easy to get him over to the Cubs games because, I mean, he was a teddy bear. And her name was Bara. And who better to entertain at Cubs games than them? So, you
It
know,
writes itself in a way, right?
But
It writes itself in a way, doesn't it?
yeah, exactly. You know, and when they got in trouble in Chicago and had to blow town, I thought, well, they'd probably find another baseball team to connect with. That was pretty good for them. And I looked up the Negro Leagues at the time and who was where, and there was a team in St. Louis. I was like, okay, they're going to St. Louis. And, that's how it went throughout the whole thing.
It was interesting that the places that they ended up all seemed like epicenters, or I guess like smaller versions of what was going on in America as a whole at the time. Like you were talking just there about segregation in baseball, something in the 20s was everywhere. So child labor laws, they kept coming across the children working on the farms. I remember, and they got them to the hospitals. Like all the things that they would find as they went through it. It was just like this horrible museum tour of all the worst
But
parts of the 1920s.
I think you could have picked any town anywhere and
Yeah.
found the same thing. St. Louis, I knew from another book where I had a guy in St. Louis, and there's the city hospital number 2 was just this rundown place just for blacks. It was the only place in town that they could go to get medical treatment. And, right at the time of both books, actually, they got like $1 million to renovate the place. And all the money sat in City Hall while they figured out what to do with it instead of using it for the actual purpose of renovating City Hospital number 2. They just kind of blew that off and tried to figure out how they could scam enough money themselves off of it to not use it on the hospital. And that happens everywhere.
I was gonna say, I think that's like a very overarching theme within this historical fiction that you made, is that it's very much based in reality. Like you have the scenes with the Cubs and what was it? Like basically they threw the World Series with the mob and everything like that. It like you said, this was happening all over America, and then you add in the aspects of the segregation. You had the Native American school, just these, like Steve said, this little museum. Yeah. Um, so I think that's for me what was so gripping about it was just, yes, this specific story might not have happened in the past, but if you know anything about the time, this is a very real thing that could have happened. And I think that's what really kept me sucked in. I mean, I ended up finishing the book in like a day and a half, so I just couldn't put it down because of it.
That's what keeps drawing me back to uh, this same series is you learn so much about it. It's kind of sad that there's so much out there. I mean, a previous book, I had this guy, he goes all over the country looking for Mark Twain. And I literally would just Google Denver, 1893, because that's when he was going through. And the first thing I would see was Chinatown riot. You know, it wasn't the Chinese rioting Chinatown. It was white people mad at one guy for being in a pool hall, and they ransacked the entire, and then later on in the book, it was like, okay, Tulsa, Oklahoma,
Ooh,
1921.
yeah, it's a bad one.
And
Oh
boom,
yeah.
this
Oh
is
no. Oh yeah.
race riot, and
Yeah.
again, they called it a race riot. Well, no, it was one black guy got caught in an elevator with a white girl, and she screamed, and still to this day, nobody knows why she screamed. They never even interviewed her. And they went over and ransacked the whole rich section of the black population and ran them all out of town.
Yeah.
And it's like you can just, you can probably Google Minneapolis any year you want, and there's something that's going to jump out and go, oh God, that was horrible.
And I think what makes it even worse is it wasn't that long ago.
No.
Like
Yeah.
it's like the 1920s, okay, it's 100 years, but in the grand scheme of things, that ain't much. And I think that's what makes all of this so poignant, is that yeah, 100 years ago, 80 years ago, I mean,
Well, to
even
this
even what
day,
was
it
it?
happens just on a smaller scale. I
Exactly.
mean, it's, police shootings, a few years ago, the guy in Minneapolis kneeling on the supposed counterfeiter's neck and killing him, and
I
it's
think
like,
I was gonna say I think what shocks me was I think it's the Arkansas or the Little Rock 6, Little Rock 5.
yeah,
Like one of them has an Instagram account, like this wasn't that long ago.
yeah, it's that incident is in another book of mine. I'm going to cover them
It's
all before it's done.
it's something that I wanted to ask you about. Will, was I've seen some of your other books. I think another of your books was at the Packard Salesman. Found its way onto my TBR as well. I was just looking through books that had been released. I went, oh, hold on, I recognise. I know this. It's that kind of 1920s vibe. Like, is it your intention to keep writing things in that kind of setting and that kind of time frame, or do you think you might advance it or anything at any point, or is there anywhere else that you want to explore or do the same
Well,
thing?
I've got 12 books so far.
Yeah.
I'm working on the 12th book in the series. And like the first one was, I started it in like 1990, and it starts in 1990 and then goes back to the Civil War and like tells two stories all the way through. And, I've written about the Great Depression, in the Roaring Twenties a lot. But, I've done the 60s. I did a kind of Vietnam War book in the 60s and early 70s. So I'm trying to cover the one I'm working on now is set in 2015, and plus some flashing back. I'm having a lot of trouble doing something that, it'd be the third book set in modern times that I've done, and they're all a struggle. It's much more fun to go back in time, try to right the wrongs.
I was gonna say, I think last time we spoke, you said your first one, like the timeline spans from, was it the American Civil War through modern day? And
Yeah.
and have you necessarily written them in that order, or kind of pick and choose?
Oh no, they jump back and forth. There's that family that was in that book, the McCoy family. everybody's kind of related if you do follow it all the way through. But and there's a bunch in Cincinnati, that I mean, I picked Cincinnati again by history. I had them in this family in Philadelphia with nowhere to go. Then they're invited to join the Philadelphia Athletics baseball team on a trip to Cincinnati. And little did they know, the owner decided it was the last road trip of the season. And he just said, I don't want to pay these guys anymore. And he canceled the games. Well, they got on the train not knowing this and ended up in Cincinnati all alone. And it was only because that little piece of history sent them to Cincinnati that a lot of my books are centered around Cincinnati. And I've never even been to Cincinnati. But
that was what I was gonna ask, is in terms of like timing, or in terms of like life experience, what cities have you lived in without being too intrusive here? And like how do they play a role in where you've written about?
Most of my life has been in Minneapolis. So Minneapolis and St. Paul, I try to fit them in when possible. The Packard salesman ends up out in California, and I spent 4 years in San Jose.
Mhm.
So again, for that book, I had the guy in Monterey visiting John Steinbeck, and he gets an invitation to go to Hollywood because he had a run-in with Babyface Nelson. And Hollywood wants to jump on that to make a movie out of it. And I just, what's going on in San Jose at this time? And there was this public lynching that was condoned by the governor. I mean, he rooted the vigilantes on, and this mob just fell upon San Jose, tore these two guys out of prison, out of the little jail, and hung them up in the park down the street. And after it was over, the governor praised them for, I think he had this quote was something like, America will learn that this is the way to run a town.
Yeah.
What?
I feel like that's American. Like American history is short compared to most other nations, I guess. But God, he's fit a lot in to a very short period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you can
there's been a
find,
lot.
if you put a date in a town, you can find a lynching.
Yeah, I've no doubt. I guess
Yeah.
it's what makes the 20s such an interesting time to write about is that you still had that. There was still a frontier of sorts. The world was still just a little wild.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that you mentioned John Steinbeck, because I'd written that down pretty early in my notes as one of what I thought was the kind of key inspirations, or what it reminded me of the most. I was like, this feels like a John Steinbeck story. Or a little later on, maybe a little bit Jack Kerouac. So I'd like to ask you a bit about your inspirations, the kind of stuff that you like to read, listen to, watch, that kind of thing. Like how much of that inspiration went into it? Where did the style of the story, I guess, kind of come from?
I've read a lot of Steinbeck and Jack Kerouac, and I don't exactly know where, I wasn't, for my first book, a buddy of mine was telling a story in a bar about his grandmother still believing this Civil War story about a dying soldier saying, take me, God, but don't let any of my sons or their sons ever have to go to war. And my first thought was, what kind of other horrible things could happen to these people that are probably worse than going to war? And I
Yeah,
told them right off, I'm stealing this. I'm using this story. And all of a sudden, and I'm like, wait a minute, I got to research the Civil War here.
yeah,
And this was before I had internet, and not many people did. I mean, I think it was 89 when I started that one. And I went down to the library and I was just wandering around, and all of a sudden I found this rack of Civil War magazines telling all these tales, who knows how true they were or anything like that.
yeah.
But I just sat there and pored over those things. And all of a sudden I was a historical fiction writer. And I'd never had any kind of goal along those lines or anything. Though I always had in the back of my mind a story of a guy chasing Mark Twain all around. In my book, The Adventures of Hank Fenn, uh, chronicles that. But that was something I'd had in the back of my mind, but it never really seemed like too big a project. And
Yeah.
I was actually just off of that. I was gonna ask, when it comes to the research that you do, I know you'll Google the town and the city and the timeline. How often do you go to like the public library and look up kind of primary research, those news articles and all of that from the time period itself?
I haven't, not much. I can't even, I know I've certainly gone and picked up books that I've run across while Googling something and read the book. But I mean, I find newspaper articles online, but as far as using the library for that, no, I haven't. Probably should.
But that's fair. It's a place that I never really go, unfortunately. I'm trying to make a better habit of it, but I remember when I was in college, we used to go for research because they had some really, really cool, just a lot more resources than you think, and it's free, which is always nice.
In the little village where I'm from, is a little place called Shotts that was a mining town and an ironworks town for a long time. Uh, so recently, so that my father worked in the mines there. And in our local library, there was a place called a heritage centre, and you could go there and they'd take you through old slides, pictures. They had all the stuff that the miners would use and stuff like that. It had all these old documents and stuff, newspapers and stuff, pictures from mine disasters, things that had went wrong, everyone marching off to war, that kind of thing. And it was watching the shifting of a community over so many generations, but so quickly together. It was really cool. If that kind of thing happens elsewhere, if you can get that in like libraries in America, that's a really cool thing to go and do. Speaking from experience.
Yes, I've
I feel
certainly,
like I should write a book. I should write a book about it.
I don't use my library enough, but I use it more than most.
Oh yeah. When I was a student, I used to live beside one, so at minimum, I would go over because it was nice and warm in winter time, and I lived in a really shoddy student flat, so I'd go and sit in the library and do uni work and stuff. Speaking of,
Yeah.
we've spoke a lot about the history and everything behind the Teddy and Bara show, but I feel like we've barely scratched on the titular characters, Teddy and Bara themselves, because oh my gosh, I found them to be just so likable. I described it to someone as Bonnie and Clyde with clowns, with clownery. One of the first notes that I made was the clownery is really great. Like the acrobatics and stuff, I felt like I could visualize it really well. It was funny when they were doing it. It was very wholesome. And given how horrific 1920s America could be, especially for two kind of like orphaned, emancipated, whatever people, I think those two and the relationship between them made the whole thing. It gave it like a really kind of comfortable, soft inside that we were always getting at. So tell me a little bit about the characters of Teddy and Bara themselves. Like, where did they come from? Did they grow with the story, or did you have an idea going in?
Well, when I thought about having somebody escape the mine and just keep running, I mean, I didn't want the typical runaway kind of story, you know. So, I made him fat and pimply and nerdy. And and he just wanted to run away. I mean, he saw an opportunity to get out and find
Yeah.
something that had to be better than what he was dealing with. And his father was abusive. His brother was a big time, about to be a small time crook who got into big time trouble.
I
Oh
But
yeah.
I loved the dynamic with the brother. I'm sorry for interrupting. I just absolutely loved the
Oh
dynamic
yeah.
with the brother. That was phenomenal.
that was fun to think of just how stupid this brother could be. The guy who was bossing him around all his life and using him to lie for him and just controlling him ends up, being what you'd expect, you know.
Yeah, like there wasn't it didn't turn into like this brother redemption arc. Like he stayed the part the whole time, which I also appreciated.
Yeah, I wasn't going to cut him any slack at all. He deserved everything he got, and it was just fun, you know, as it went on. It was like, we got to get something going on here, to connect it more with the story. And, it's like, oh, I'll get the brother in there, babyface Nelson's escape from Joliet prison. All I could find was somebody gave him a gun, you know, somebody helped him escape, but it didn't name anybody. And I was like, his brother's down there. He played football in Chicago. He'll give him the gun, and that'll get him thrown in prison, which it ended up doing. So he was kind of my scapegoat for anything I needed to happen. All of a sudden, I just have to think, can't remember his name now. I think, what would he do? How stupid would he be to get involved in this?
I found it really fascinating how many of the really rough situations they got themselves into. It turned out that clownery of some description was the way that they would escape from it. Like, I thought, like, most creative usage of clowning in a story that I've seen by anyone. I loved all the weird ways that they got out of things. Like, was it when they almost got into a fight and turned it into a comedy routine in the street? That was like one of their first instances. I loved all the weird clownery. Even in some of the more poignant moments, like where they're cheering up the children and stuff. And oh man, it had such a heart as well. I really loved the heart that the book had, with Teddy and Bara being such a well bonded kind of couple through their horrible shared traumas. Especially the part near the end when Bara's in a coma and Teddy's thinking that he can hear her. And it turned out, oh, I really thought we were getting like a horribly dark ending. So I'm really glad it turned out like a much happier situation. Did you change the ending? Like, did you know when you were there, or did you decide to change it as you went?
I early on, I made a hard, fast ending was going to be when Al Capone got sent to Alcatraz. I thought,
Sweet, yeah.
that'll bring it all around and they'll be happy. And at the same time was a trial with this guy named Fauché. I mean, there's Fauché Towers still one of the tallest buildings in Minneapolis, and he was just a con man. I mean, he built it on no money of his
Oh yeah,
own. I mean, and and he finally caught up with him. The Depression wiped him out, and and everybody who had invested with him went down with him because he didn't. All their money was long gone, and he finally went to
yeah,
trial. And I thought, well, I gotta carry it through. That was about the same timeline. And then I was reading all about the trial and everything, and then like there was like related cases or something. I clicked on that, and here was this a secretary that he had, who somehow they got on the jury. I mean, she wasn't. There were like 600 jurors to pick from, and her name wasn't even in the 600. But somehow they slipped her name in there and got her on the jury, and she was the one vote that hung the jury. And I'm like, so then I had to extend it through that, and so then I had to keep finding things for Teddy and Bara to do
I think
while
that
this is still going on, because I couldn't just forget about them.
I think that's part of the big beauty of the book for myself is that they're surrounded by crooks. Teddy and Bear are absolutely surrounded by crooks, and even through it all, with their difficult history, their difficult past, all of that, they're still trying their best to make an honest living where they're not necessarily putting money for like first. Like they're going out clowning, and a lot of it is to just help like brighten people's day and then take what they can on the way out. But they had their little entrepreneurial streak as well, and that they ended up dealing with other forms of crooks, more white collar ones. And I think all of that just it really shines a light on how genuine these characters are and how much you wanted to root for them throughout the story. But I'm looking at the time. We have 2.5 minutes left before Zoom cuts us off because we don't pay for Zoom.
Oh,
I know. So I wanna ask if people liked the Teddy and Bara show, which of your stories do you recommend they read next? And where can they best find you?
well, if the Packard salesman picks up right where Teddy and Bear left off,
Mhm.
and it brings Teddy and Bear back in as well.
Oh,
They're,
oh, I didn't know that.
yeah.
I'll be checking that out.
they're actually uh, mistaken for Bonnie and Clyde in the
Oh,
Packard
That's
sales.
perfect.
And oh, somebody just disappeared.
yeah, that's Steve. He'll figure it out.
Okay, it's just my camera being weird. Don't worry about it.
I was thinking that was a quick 2.5 minutes.
Now you got
But
a minute and a half left.
yeah, that directly, and if you Grace, the woman who helps him out at Wrigley Field
Mhm.
and ends up dying, she's in virtually every book,
Oh,
either
interesting.
thought back on,
Interesting.
or she's the focal point of the first novel and keeps coming back all the
Mhm.
time. And trying to think, oh, Angela uh, Farnsworth, the rich woman who cheats him, she's in a bunch of my books. Either, uh, well, there's one that tells her whole story, the miracles, and Bonus Man. She
Oh,
she
Will,
ends up.
I hate to cut you off. We have 20 seconds left, but it was absolutely lovely to get to speak with you. I'm going to add, I see on the back of your book, you have your link to your blog, your website, all of that. I'm going to put that all in the description. Thank you again so much for joining us. Thank you for writing such a wonderful novel and participating. For those of you that made it this far, it was the Teddy and Bara Show. Pick it up. Please read it. Thank you both again so much for being here.